So one of the key things I do, and this very much came out of the data, so looking at the court transcripts and seeing the sorts of things that were being talked about, one of the key things that became very clear was there was this sense in the transcripts that all of these women should have been responsible mothers. And the responsible mother, from the analysis of the literature that I use, is effectively pulling on the idea of the myths of motherhood, which has come from feminist theorization around how motherhood is perceived and understood, and women are expected to behave as mothers. And then also a more recent literature which talks about how pregnant women are effectively required to be responsible in order to protect the well-being of their fetus. And you bring them together, you effectively have the idea a good mother is going to be a responsible pregnant woman. So if the idea being she's going to do everything she can to put her fetus first, regardless of her own wishes and intent and desires, it's the fetus that is the most important. And if she doesn't do those things, then she's clearly the bad mother and the irresponsible pregnant woman. And this is very much tied up with ideas of risk. So there's no such thing as a no-risk pregnancy these days. Every pregnancy is risky. It's just that some are more risky than others. And pregnant women act as both protectors of a fetus, whilst also potentially causing the fetus risk if they're not going to do what they should to make sure that the fetus is in the best position possible and the best protected, and other suggestions of things that pregnant women should do. Interestingly, those ideas also kind of now exist before women get pregnant. So the World Health Organization is still contemplating whether or not it should produce guidance that says that any woman of reproductive age shouldn't drink alcohol just in case she gets pregnant, because that would then arguably be a risk to the fetus. Probably don't get me started on that one, but I'm happy to have a rant about it in questions afterwards because it just makes me livid. But we can see these risk narratives taking place. So perhaps unsurprisingly, the vast majority of the women in the study that I look at are very much constructed as the bad mother, but also the irresponsible pregnant woman. And the things that very much come out when there's a discussion of what's happening in these cases and how the woman has behaved is this idea that she's failed to put her fetus first and she's failed to manage that fetus's risk. And both of these things come together to very much make the woman a bad mother. So for example, and I think this is probably one of my favorite cases out of all of them. So this is from the case of Sally, who was convicted of the concealment of birth. So she hid the dead body of her baby after it had been born, stillborn. So as the judge said, your chaotic lifestyle choices, including alcohol abuse and promiscuity at the time of your pregnancies, was such as to put the good health of any unborn child at risk. Now, I just think one of the key aspects around this remark in sentencing, and that really comes out in pretty much all of the transcripts, this idea that actually her key failure here has been how she behaved while she was pregnant, which in many respects should have been completely irrelevant when we're thinking about the offence that she was convicted of. So she was convicted of concealment of birth, which is an offence of hiding a dead body, effectively. That's what the crime is meant to do. That's what the statute says. But as we can see, this offence is effectively being, or what is being expressed in the court is that actually a big part of her failings is how she behaved while she was pregnant. So this very much has led to the conclusion that I've drawn in the book that actually a key aspect here is that prosecutors have this menu of criminal offences that they can draw on and they can use depending upon the situation and the circumstances within these cases. So if they can prove live birth, and they obviously have the offences that are available for any person once they've been born alive. But if they can't prove live birth, they have these other offences that they can effectively use as what I deem proxies for fetal homicide laws. So in exactly the same way as we can see concealment of birth being the offence here, the actual focus is much more upon her failure as a pregnant woman and her failure to manage the risk she posed to her fetus.
It's a hugely challenging book, but in a good sense. It's a book which provokes, prompts, points, politicizes and persuades. It turns things upside down by suggesting perhaps that it's not surprising that some women do kill their own newborn children, given the fact that society creates a situation whereby pregnancy is often experienced as a crisis, as you've just described, to the extent where women feel they can't accept and respond to their pregnancies. So I think Emma asks searching questions about what societal influences there are which drive women to take steps to illegally end their pregnancy, or indeed not take steps to seek help when they realise that they're about to give birth.
So, final obligation, Loraine wants judges to read your book. I would like parliamentarians to read it, because there's such clear implications here for law reform. I think I would challenge anyone. I mean, I'm sure Loraine said your book was provocative, and I'm sure it will annoy a lot of people, and that's all well and good, isn't it? That's I think that's part of our job as academics. But I would challenge anyone to come away from this book wanting to defend this incoherent patchwork of legal principles that we have in this area at the moment. So even the 15 cases that you've been able to find and to get the transcripts for, 15 cases is enough to demonstrate how starkly inconsistent these rules are in their application. And you might hope that the Law Commission would think that this was an appropriate area to look into. So Law Commission charged with codifying law, eliminating anomalies, repealing obsolete and unnecessary enactments, reducing the number of separate statutes. The Law Commission actually, as some people in this meeting will know, in 2015 decided it was going to look into the Offences against the Person Act, which is the statute that contains the abortion offence and the concealment of birth offence that Emma talked about. And they wanted to look into that because they thought it was anachronistic, that the language was anachronistic, it contained overlapping offences, there was inconsistency in sentencing. So all of the stuff that Emma's wonderful book teaches us is wrong with this particular area of law that she's describing. But the Law Commission decided that it couldn't look at these offences, abortion, concealment of birth, because they are political. They raise political issues that are outside its remit. So the Law Commission won't look at it. Government doesn't want to look at it because these are divisive issues inside political parties as well as between them that generate nasty letters. Private members' legislation is really unlikely to be able to resolve any of these problems unless the government gives time to help that kind of legislation get through. So it's an incredibly hard nut to try and crack, even though you've shown so clearly what's wrong with this area of law. Which isn't, of course, just to conclude, to say that we need to stop trying. And I'm so glad that you've written this book and made these arguments and set out this evidence base, because I think this is what academic work can do in this area. So congratulations to you.
But I want to start by noticing that you embraced full throttle patriarchy, and I loved it. Just like, it's time to dust off that word and really talk about the frame that it gives us for understanding what years ago Marilyn Frye wrote about the double bind. And it's an essay that I read when I was just a baby feminist myself, called Oppression, where she talks about one of the hallmarks of patriarchy is that every road is mined. Every road, right? Female sexuality, you can be a slut, you can be a prude. There is no safe way to navigate that path. And I thought about it in reading your book, because the best filicide defense requires explaining the action of killing your child in terms that the patriarchy can understand. A desperate woman, abandoned, her mind imbalanced by those weird bodily functions, right? You have to blame and pathologize the individual for what are ultimately societal or structural ills.